Do you remember your favorite bedtime story? Do you remember your favorite bedtime story? Maybe it was Possum Magic. Remember this? A classic. That's a core memory for me. Do you remember? Or maybe it was Rainbow Fish, It taught me the importance of sharing. Rainbow Fish did last week. So maybe that was it. Or maybe it's the tale of Peter Rabbit. Do you remember that one? Yeah. All I know is that I remember asking Mum to read me bedtime stories. I hated going to bed. I still do. But I remember asking Mum to read me a bedtime story. And I would try and stay awake. I'd try to fight sleep, but then she would come and read me a story and it would do the trick. So Mum tells me it would go like this. She would go to tuck in little 4-year-old Igor, tuck him into bed and start reading a story maybe of Joseph or Moses and the Red Sea, maybe of David and Goliath. But after reading the story, she would see my eyelids get heavy, see me start to drift off into sleep, and she would go to turn the light off. And just as she did, she would hear a still small voice. Hey, Mum, can you read me another story? And that hasn't changed. I still love hearing stories like we had over Move of God weekend, of Stella sharing her homecoming story, of Pastor Andy Harrison sharing how God had moved in his family and still does, and how God protects them and healed their daughter in the middle of a crisis. And there are more stories, church, in this room of God moving that only you can tell. And so really, I believe that every move of God has this specific purpose of writing a testimony, writing a story that we then share, and that it ultimately brings glory to his name. That is why God moves. And today I just want to tell you something really simple. It's the same thing that 4-year-old little Iggy Wiggy Woo would tell you, which is this. Tell me your story. Share your story, okay? Share your story. You see, we see in John chapter 9, we see this man who also experiences a move of God. Jesus steps into his story. He was born blind. He was born in a completely uncontrollable situation, in the depths of poverty, begging on the streets to try and minimize the financial burden that he had on his family. And Jesus steps into his story. He experiences a move of God and he's healed. And then he has this incredible testimony, and he comes back home, and the neighbors are then talking amongst themselves. They don't even believe it. They're talking to each other, and they're saying, is this the same guy? No, it sure looks like him. Is this the same beggar that was on the streets? No, it can't be him, but it looks like him. And he responds, and he says, yes, that was me. And this is where it picks up in John 9, 10 and 11. So they said to him, how were your eyes opened? And he answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. They were so amazed by this story that they then took him to the local authorities, and we keep reading in verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So Pharisees, again, they asked him, how had he received his sight? And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes, I washed, and I see. My first point is this. You are qualified to share your story, okay? We see this man, he had no formal training. He had no public speaking experience at all. He wasn't even one of the 12 disciples. We don't even know his name. It's quite funny. He's not the main character, as we would say in City Youth. He had zero aura, but we don't know who he is. But that didn't stop him from sharing his story. And I love that he didn't go into great detail either. He didn't write a New York Times bestseller or tell-all autobiography, of how Jesus healed me, clear as mud. I don't know. He didn't do any of that. He tried to use as few words as possible. It's incredible, really. He says it in 15 seconds or less to his neighbors. He says this. So this man called Jesus comes in. He basically makes his mud, puts it on my eyes, told me to go to this place. I go there, I'm healed, and that's the story. He simplifies it. And then when the Pharisees ask him, again, he basically grunts. He's like, mud, eyes, wash, see. Why use lot word when few word do trick? My point is this. Anyone can and should share their story. You should share your story. You don't need my permission, by the way, but if you're looking for it, here it is. Share your story with anyone who will listen. Tell them what God is doing in your life. Share your story. See, when God moves, things change, and as a result, we change. And people around us, they can see that change. So much so that we see the neighbors were asking to hear his story. When God moves in your life, the people around you can see it, and they want to hear your story. And we see his story. We see his backstory here, which is in John 9, 1-7. So again, as Jesus, passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground, made mud with saliva. We'll just skip through that. Then anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. There's a lot to unpack there, some interesting methodology that I'm not game enough to try. But you see this man born in an impossible situation. And again, in a culture that viewed being born with a disability as punishment. That's crazy. Let's stop there for a minute. The disciples, they asked him this. They said, "Jesus, who is this? Who sinned here? Whose fault is it?" Basically saying, was it this man or was it his parents? Because they viewed someone born with a disability as being punished either for their own sins or the sins of their ancestors. And maybe this is getting a bit too real, but this is basically what they're saying. This man is written off from the day he was born. Can you imagine what that's like, church, to be written off from the day you were born? Yeah. Maybe it's getting a little bit too real. Maybe you find yourself in a situation where you're facing consequences of someone else's actions. It's not even your fault. Maybe you're on the receiving end of something you could never control. I don't know your backstory. Maybe it's one of financial or health challenges. Maybe it's from a family of breakdown or the loss of a loved one, of trauma or abuse. I don't know what your backstory is, but I know this. Jesus answers. And we'll read it again. He says this, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." I love what he's saying here. Jesus, rather than assigning blame, is just saying this. No, this is the perfect backstory for a move of God. Now, your story, your situation, no matter how far gone you might think it is the perfect backstory for a move of God. God can use your story. He can turn it around and use it for his glory. You know, this is my backstory. This is me and my dad. I have a photo up on the screen. He's the man who raised me, the man who cared for me and looked after me when my biological father chose not to. He's the man who would pick me up out of the car in the back seat, even well into my high school years when I was just too lazy. I'd fallen asleep, let's just say, and carry me into my room and put me to bed. He's the man who gave me my name, Igor, gave me his last name. He's the man that God used to give me a glimpse of the love of a father. He's the man that God used to show me how God the Father loves his children. And when I think of the love of a father, I think of this man. This is the man who I also saw battle with motor neurone disease and I lost at the age of 15. But despite that, God put people into my life. Jesus stepped into my story through countless people. A youth leader like Tom, who would take me to youth every week in the black Mitsubishi Lancer. I still remember that. Jesus stepped into my story through various people, spiritual fathers and people that invested in me and cared for me. And by the grace of God, I'm not another statistic shaped by fatherlessness. You see, God stepped into my story and he used it for his glory, for a testimony, and he can do the same thing for you. So this is my next point. Your backstory is the perfect canvas for a move of God. Very good. You see, God can often use the things that are written off that by all standards should not succeed for his glory. And when he does this, you're left with an incredible testimony. But maybe you're in the middle ground there. Maybe you're like this blind man who has an experience with God. God touches him. He literally encounters Jesus, but he's not healed right away, if you notice. Jesus touches his eyes, but then says to the man in John 9:7, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Maybe you encountered the presence of God last weekend. Maybe you felt a touch of God, but you still have yet to see your situation change or a move of God in your situation. Can I tell you this? Don't give up on the road to Siloam. Don't give up on the road to Siloam, where Jesus had sent him, the place where God's promise meets reality. Don't give up on the road to Siloam. I wonder how many people gave up just because it cost too much, it took too long, or it was too uncomfortable. Don't give up on the road to Siloam, because I tell you, when that happens, you're going to be left with an incredible testimony, an undeniable one. You see, when the healed man returned home, his neighbors couldn't deny his testimony. They saw him. I mean, it's pretty easy to test. How many fingers am I holding up? But it was undeniable. But still, they tried to question his testimony. And now I myself, I have no legal training or expertise. I'm not like our founding pastor, Pastor Mark. But I have my fair share in dealing with questionable witness testimonies. Yeah, so at youth camp earlier this year, we had an interesting situation, let's just put it that way. We had some boys who will remain unnamed, throw some food around in their cabin and get up to all sorts of tomfoolery. False accusations were made and the tensions began to rise. This was where I discovered that the role of a youth pastor has two separate but equally important roles: to police and investigate the crimes, and that of a district attorney who prosecutes the offenders. In the course of my investigation, I found some of the witnesses to be collaborating and providing a false testimony, meaning things had to get serious. And I called another leader to help me as we separated the suspects, and we got them to tell their stories individually. We soon found the inconsistencies, and we were able to find those who weren't telling the truth and prosecute them to the full extent of the law. You see, when God leaves you with a testimony, it is undeniable, and it is true, it's beyond question. And you see this, your testimony that God is giving you is undeniable, church. In Revelation 12:10, it says this, that the enemy is defeated by two things. Firstly, the blood of the Lamb. In other words, what God has done, a move of God. And secondly, by the word of our testimony. In other words, God is defeated. The enemy is defeated by a move of God and us sharing our testimonies of what he has done. We see the healed man, he withstood the unbelief that surrounded him. And the Pharisees, though, they did try to question him. And basically, I'll give you a rundown. They try and pull in his parents and say, this man was never blind to begin with. They tried to discredit Jesus and say, he's not of God. But ultimately, they couldn't deny his testimony. In verse 24 to 25, we see this. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man, Jesus, is a sinner. And so he answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. That though I was blind, now I see. After all the debating, all the arguments were said and done, he could easily counter it with his testimony. Though I was blind, now I see. Though I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease and put on immunosuppressants for 2 years, and they said that could never be cured, I now stand with you having a doctor's report saying no trace of that disease is in my body. Though I was blind, now I see. What is your testimony, church? And can you share it? Can I urge you to stop and reflect on what God is doing and has done in your life? And firstly, write it down. Your testimony is powerful and it's an anchor that can hold you through the storm. I know that I can trust God with my tomorrow because I've seen him move in my yesterday. So write it down. And the second thing is to keep it in your back pocket. If someone asks you to share your testimony, to share why you believe what you believe, would you be able to tell them? Would you be able to tell them your testimony of what God has done in your life? You don't need to study apologetics and memorize the Apostles' Creed or be able to tell this incredible sermon. All you need to do is say, this is what God has done in my life. You should come and see for yourself. Though I was blind, now I see. And maybe you will too if you come to church next Sunday. So would you share your story with those around you, with us? We've even sent out an email earlier this week where you can share your story with us, your testimony of what God is doing. I believe there are hundreds of stories in the room and stories yet to be written outside of these four walls, that people that need to hear your story. And again, our vision of homecoming and harvest this year cannot be done without, firstly, a move of God, and secondly, the word of your testimony. So can I encourage you again to share your story? At City Youth, we had some incredible stories. We've been doing this thing called CY Story over the past year, where leaders and students have been sharing their stories, and there have been some incredible ones like that of Lavina, who experienced the love of God through people of this church like Tanya McKenna stepping into her school and then experiencing a move of God at City Youth Camp. I've seen stories of that like Brendan O'Reilly, where he was talking about God being with him in the storm of a health challenge that he's facing. There are countless stories in this room that need to be shared. So again, this is an incredibly practical message, I guess, because all I need you to do is the same thing again that 4-year-old me would tell you, which is to share your story.